You may recall that we concluded our last course back in May with a study of the rabbinic ethical treatise, Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers. I'm going to begin this series with another quote from that same ethical anthology to give us some continuity. Rabbi Hanania ben Tiradion says, "If two sit together and words of Torah pass between them, God's presence is with them." A nice thought. The rabbis had an intellectualist mode of piety. They firmly believed that the intellectual engagement with God's word is itself a spiritual exercise. Now, as with all things human, it's possible to do that wrong. Right? It's possible to engage only the head and not the heart. That's always a problem that people are vulnerable to. But allowing for that, what Rabbi Hanania is saying is that there is spiritual potential in our engagement at the intellectual level with the ideas that our religious tradition gives us. Jews and Christians, some other religions too, to be sure, are text-grounded traditions. For us, the world of nature is not a surrogate for scriptures. As we're going to see, there's a very positive religious appreciation of the world of nature, but we don't take all of our inspiration from the world of nature. We want some of our inspiration to be from the historic records of the encounter we feel that we've had with the divine. And in Christianity and in Judaism, there are corpora of texts that memorialize that. The shared corpus is the Hebrew Testament, known as the Old Testament in some Christian circles. So I'm going to begin today with a different kind of analysis of what I think is a very famous narrative. In fact, the first narrative in the Hebrew scriptures. Then I'm going to move on to a couple of rabbinic reflections upon that narrative, which may be less familiar to this audience. I imagine that most everyone here is a graduate of one or another kind of Sunday school. You may think happily back on those days. You may think ruefully back on those days. By the way, the same thing is true if you're a teacher in those schools. My wife once told me a wonderful little joke. "Seymour, wake up. It's time to go to school." "Oh, I don't want to go to school." "Seymour, wake up. You got to go." "I don't want to go to school." "Seymour, you got to go to school. You're the principal." You might appreciate that. So we probably have a well-formed understanding of the creation story. I want to add another layer so that our well-formed will be additionally informed and maybe transformed. The main area where I'd like to invite you to think about the creation story differently is with the notion that it's page one. You open the book. I open my book from right to left, but that's a matter of history, right? You open your book, on page one after the table of contents, you get, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," or a more recent translation, "When God began to create heaven and earth. ... because the sentence isn't completed. It certainly sounds like the beginning, sounds like a first story, but I want us to go back to the living history of the people who recorded that story. Granted, I'm modeling a non-fundamentalist appreciation of our scriptures, because if they came fully formed from the brow of Zeus, as it were, right? If the stories slid into this world from heaven, then it's not really very fruitful to think about what were the context of that story. So that's not where I'm coming from. But I actually think that understanding, to use the word of the great Protestant Bible scholar G. Ernest Wright, how the Old Testament is against its environment, understanding that will actually enhance, not detract from, but enhance our appreciation for its actual message. So, when the Israelites first began reciting and attending to this narrative of creation, what was everyone else saying? Did our story dissent from their story? It did. In its descent, what can we learn about what our story is really trying to say? So it's important to recover the context. We never knew completely what the context was, and we still don't know completely, but over the last 2 centuries, the work of the archaeologist has given us a tremendously enhanced appreciation of what were the creation stories of the neighbors of the people Israel, so that we can understand what were we rejecting when we said, when God began to create heaven and earth, God said, "Let there be light." In 1849, archaeologists investigating the tell of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal discovered most of a creation myth. Creation myth is known after its 2 first words, Enuma Elish, was unearthed, literally unearthed in 1849. A translation was published in 1876, further translations going into the early 20th century. And here's the story. You have it on the bottom of page 2 and page 3 of your study guides today. The myth posits that water was primordial. Water is not the subject of the act of creation. It was just there. Mommy, where was I before I was born? Well, you were floating in the water of my womb. So the water was just there. We learn from the great mythographer Mircea Eliade that in the mythologies of many different peoples, water is thought of as uncreated. Well, this is true of the ancient Mesopotamian peoples as well. Water was uncreated. By the way, I wonder, I don't know this for a fact, but as a seed which may grow into a plant for further study for anyone here, I wonder if there isn't a little echo of that in the Bible. Just a little echo. In the beginning, when God began to create heaven and earth, and yet later on, for example, in the 10 Commandments, it says, "Make no image of anything that is in the heavens or the earth or the waters below the earth." Why is waters not stipulated as one of the things created? So perhaps there's a little echo of this once very, very common idea. Anyway, there were 2 kinds of water. There was salt water and fresh water. And think about it. If you're living around the Persian Gulf, if you're living at an estuary where the Tigris and the Euphrates empty into the waters of the world ocean, then this notion of fresh water and salt water being primordial and them commingling would kind of make sense in terms of the empirical observations of the world that you live in. So those were the first two entities. They are personified in ancient mythology. And one of the most important things about the Bible is that it, I don't know if there's a word depersonify, but you know what I mean. It takes away the personal agent status of the putative god of fresh water, goddess of the briny deep. Anyway, the god of the fresh water is Apsu. It sounds to me like the word abyss, actually. And the goddess of the briny deep is Tiamat. And we're going to see that that relates to a Hebrew word for the deep waters. So they got together and created heavenly beings who began to make a lot of noise. Now, you know, as we get older, the merry tinkle of children's laughter becomes less enjoyable at certain times of the day. So, in this ancient myth, Apsu and Tiamat were going to kill their grandchildren. Now, I know that sounds a bit harsh, but isn't that what Uranos was doing to Kronos' generation? Isn't that what Kronos was doing to Zeus's generation? There's a lot in the ancient mythologies of the world about this kind of strife. And it's not only Oedipal, it seems to go in the infanticidal direction as well. Well, that didn't happen because Apsu was overcome, but Tiamat is still alive. Now, I want you to try to imagine Tiamat. Imagine the surging of the ocean breakers. Imagine the ocean in a Category 5 hurricane. Imagine the perfect storm. A terrible movie, but you know, you understand, right? It's awesome. It's awesome. Now, for the ancient pagans, it was awesome and it was personified. So Tiamat was the bigger, badder sister of Grendel's mother. If you remember Beowulf, right? Beowulf can handle Grendel, he can't handle Grendel's mother, right? So Grendel's mother is the shrimpy little cousin of Tiamat. Now you get a sense of who we're talking about, okay? So Tiamat is still on this murderous goal. She's going to off all these gods who are terrified. No one can stand up to her. Enter one swaggering, brash, Sylvester Stallone type god named Marduk. Just happens to be the tutelary divinity of the city of Babylon. Guess where the story is being told? So our hometown hero, right, took on the big bad monster goddess of the briny deep and defeated her. And the story of how he defeated her makes for very good reading, but that you should do for further reading. We won't take time on it now. Point is, he wins, she loses, he dismembers her. The top half of Tiamat he turns into the heavens. The bottom half of Tiamat he turns into the earth. He's got, you know, the world on a half shell. Okay, it's pretty gory. And if you think about what does that make us, it makes us animated bits of gore. Not so exalted, but okay, that's who we are. Now, this is not simply a just so story. You're familiar with the concept just so stories. This is not a just so story because this was a sacred scripture enacted as part of religious ceremony at the high holiday season for the people who cherish this myth. The festival was known as Akitu, A-K-I-T-U. It was the first 10 days or fortnight of the month of Nisanu, which is the Babylonian word for the Hebrew word Nisan, which means the springtime month. Remember, it says in Exodus chapter 12, this month, meaning the springtime month, shall be the beginning of the months of the year for you. Well, that is the month of Nisan in the Babylonian language, Nisanu, and they had a huge festival, a New Year's festival at Nisan. In some other parts of Mesopotamia, they did it in the fall, which has been borrowed by the Jewish people, and that's why we have our Rosh Hashanah in the fall. We just had our New Year and our Day of Atonement coming up this Tuesday night and Wednesday. That also borrows from the Babylonian calendar, but this particular festival was more often celebrated at the beginning of Nisan, when the moon was waxing, the first half of the month. The story would be ceremonially retold. What's more, it would be enacted. The various gods who take part in the story would be brought down, maybe down the river, or put on barges, or put on carts, and they'd be put around the temple where Marduk was temporarily in Tiamat's dungeon, and they would save Marduk, and they would use their idols in a kind of a kabuki theater in order to celebrate that order has triumphed over chaos. Because that's the bottom line message. Bottom line message is Tiamat is the forces of chaos, and Marduk for them is the forces that order the creation. By the way, that's where the word cosmos comes from. Those of you who have the Greek background, you may know that cosmos and cosmetics come from the same linguistic root, right? Because I know people who used to say, I have to fix my face. Did you ever hear people talk that way? I have to put my face in correct order, right? I have to cosmetize, right? The same word as cosmos, ultimately. So, creation as ordering, I think you heard this from Father Wynn last week. Creation as ordering characterizes Jewish and Christian understanding of what is creation, but it's not unique to Judaism and Christianity. Moreover, the idea that creation owes its very existence to a creator does not begin with Jews and Christians. That's why Genesis 1 is really not the first word. If we want to see what is different about our story, our shared story, well, what you know from Sunday school is that it's one God. And this, by the way, is corroborated by the Hebrew verb. In Hebrew, verbs are conjugated. You have the stem, and then you have a series of prefixes and suffixes and infixes and vocalizations that modify the stem to give you person, number, tense, etc., etc. So the word for third person singular, he created, has the same stem as they created, but they created has an additional suffix. He said would be vayomer. They said would have an u, the u of plural, vayomru. So in Genesis chapter 1, you have this deity, Elohim. Now, Elohim could be a plural form, it could be a singular form. What's decisive is the verb. And the verb you have in verse 3 of Genesis is vayomer, not vayomru, but vayomer. God, not the gods. God said, let there be light. And this, although you didn't know the Hebrew grammar from Sunday school, but this is what you learned in Sunday school, that what's distinct about the biblical account is that it's monotheistic. I want to tell you that when you contrast, quote-unquote, our story with, quote-unquote, their story, you see another distinction which is as important. And that distinction is a consequence of monotheism. There's no adversary. There's no theomachy. There's no warfare amongst the gods. That's very important. How does God do it? Well, it couldn't be simpler. Vayomer, God said, let there be light. Now, in Latin, let there be is fiat. F-I-A-T, fiat. And in English today we have, it was done by fiat. In other words, someone said it. It's like the Ten Commandments movie. So let it be written, so let it be done. You remember that from Yul Brynner's having that? Right. Okay, so it's done by fiat. God doesn't break a sweat in making the world. God certainly doesn't overcome the big bad Tiamat. That leads to further consequences that are very important. You know, when you make a move on the chessboard of theology, it changes the position. It opens up certain possibilities. It forecloses certain other possibilities. And that's true in life in general. When you say that there is no transcendent enemy whom our God vanquished, then you have to answer the persistent question. Again, I'll give you the Latin. Unde malum. Where does evil come from? Where does evil come from? The standard biblical answer focuses on the evil that people do. Humans are responsible for evil. In the Song of Moses, Deuteronomy chapter 32, he says, Shichet lo, banav mumam. Is corruption his? No, his children are at fault. You and I are the source of the evil that's in this world. That's the basic biblical answer. So who is not, or what is not, the basic source of evil in this world? Well, in the Hebrew Scriptures, the devil is not the source of evil in this world. The devil made me do it is not a Hebrew scriptural line. You do have the figure of a Satan, which means adversary, but that's not the C.S. Lewis type, transcendent, wily opponent. I could say Milton as well, right? Opponent of God. Satan in the book of Zacharias, chapter 3, is the Commonwealth attorney. Anyone here a district attorney? Do we have any prosecuting attorneys here? You are an officer of the court. You're doing the court's work. The prosecuting attorney is doing God's work. Now, a little bit like Hamilton Berger on Perry Mason. Satan doesn't win a lot of cases when God is both judge and advocate for defense. But it's important to realize that Satan in the Hebrew prophets is not the enemy of God. Now, Satan shows up in the preface to the book of Job, and we studied this last December. There too, Satan is not an enemy of God. Satan is a kind of like a tricky, persnickety law clerk to the Supreme Court justice. Okay? A good friend of mine who's a professor of constitutional law at the Sandra Day O'Connor Law School, Arizona State, did his work clerking at pretty high levels of the judiciary when he was at that stage. And he would talk to me about his work, and he felt it was his job to push his boss, to be his best, to be her best. And so he would sometimes try and push a position, and he'd win some, he'd lose some, but he's still working for he's clerking for that judge. He's not against that judge. So the idea of a transcendent evil that is the enemy of God enters into Judaism somewhat later in our history. In the Bible itself, evil is the human fruit of the fact that God voluntarily self-constrains. There are plenty of places in the Bible where God says, "You think there's anything I can't do?" Moses says to God, "How am I possibly going to get enough meat to feed these people? If I had herds and flocks," God says, "You think my hand's too short?" And then, this huge, quail school, quail, what do you call it when all the birds are in formation? Flock. This huge flock, wings its way in, right? So there is one thing God chooses not to do. God chooses not to force you and me to be moral. God promises, God teaches, God instructs, God cajoles, God sometimes threatens, God thunders, but God ultimately leaves that as your decision. God didn't put up a force field around Abel. God didn't restrict Cain by giving him sudden paralysis. God expects you to make this world a more moral place. That's the classic biblical, and it became the classic Jewish answer. Of course, that move on the theological chessboard leaves Judaism in a difficult place when it comes to explaining what we call natural evil. Childhood illnesses, right? Birth defects, those sorts of things. And later on, you have Jewish responses to that as well, that emerge from later within the Jewish tradition and are therefore constrained by the earlier steps. But basically, the world is good in the Jewish account of creation, and that too is a consequence of this story. And you see not exactly on every day, I'll explain that. Essentially, at each day's work, it says, God saw the A, God saw the B, God saw the C, that it was good. God saw the light, that it was good. Now, in the current Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible, you have no statement on the second day of the week, which is Monday, that God saw that it was good, and you have two statements on the third day of the week, which is Tuesday, that God saw that it was good. If you look at the Hebrew Bible in English translation, you'll see that. In other ancient witnesses to the text, we have one seeing that it's good for each of the days. It seems most likely that we have a simple scribal error of a transposing of that sentence to the next paragraph. Consequently, when the text of the Bible was canonized, we have no seeing that it's good on Monday and two seeings that it's good on Tuesday. Result, in Orthodox Judaism today, you don't want to get married on a Monday. You really want to get married on a Tuesday because it's a double good day. And that's still practiced in Judaism today. So sometimes even scribal mistakes can be productive of interesting folkways and customs. So the world is good. Now, the world is good means we're obliged to treat it that way. There are certain systems, some of them were Gnostic systems, where the material world is essentially not good. Essentially, it's pretty bad. And what is your human vocation? Your human vocation is to escape that prison. Get beyond it to something which is truly good. That's not what the Bible's story is moving us to say. The Bible story is moving you to the point of saying the world is good. I need to live in it, respecting it. That's where the stewardship of creation comes in. We spoke about that last week, I believe. All that is certainly consistent with reading the biblical story and gleaning its messages. So we inherit from this biblical account of creation notions of orderliness, goodness, human stewardship that comes from that. In my remaining time, we could certainly talk more about the Bible. I haven't talked at all about the Adam and Eve story, but I want to focus on the rabbinic responses to the story I've just quoted. So I need to explain what Midrash is. The word Midrash means inquiry. There are two kinds of Midrash. There's Midrash Halacha, a legalistic inquiry. Right? When it says, do no manner of work on the Sabbath day, what does it actually mean? You have in the Gospels echoes of some of the debates over that, and you have those same debates in rabbinics. You know, if someone is trapped in a house which has fallen down and they're crying for help, is it impermissible work to dig them out? And the rabbis say, no, it's not only is it permitted, it's commanded that you should save a life. But those are the conversations that would come up when it says in the constitutional authoritative text, do no manner of work on the Sabbath day. Well, what does that actually mean? What's the domain of that speech? Where does that speech end? Where does some other divine speech establish a boundary with it? You have that in the Midrash all the time, just as you have in any legal culture, where there's an older text and we have to establish the parameters of how does it command us. Then you have something called Midrash Agada. Agada means narrative, telling. So the Midrash Agada is an inquiry into what the Bible is saying to us, pursued in narrative form. Now, you may know the name of a big professor of literature at University of Virginia named E.D. Hirsch. I don't know if you know his book, Validity and Interpretation. Hirsch has a distinction between meaning and significance. It's a useful terminology. What does to be or not to be mean? Hirsch would say, this may be unrecoverable, but at least as an ideal that you strive toward, it's what Shakespeare meant it to mean. That's what it means. Now, it may be unrecoverable, but at least it gives you this star to steer by. But that doesn't exhaust what that sentence signifies to us. To be or not to be may mean something very different if a world is facing extinction. I mean, think of The Day the Earth Stood Still, that great science fiction classic. Right? To be or not to be, well, are we going to curb our production of nuclear weapons? To be or not to be? Or think of the Keanu Reeves remake of The Day the Earth Stood Still. To be or not to be? Well, are we going to stop destroying our planet? To be or not to be? So you see, a word may have its meaning a long time ago, or yesterday, and it may have added layers of significance for today and for tomorrow. And two different layers of significance may not agree with each other, but they're both descended from that original text. That's what a midrash is. A midrash will tell a sidebar story in order to explore possible areas of significance of the Bible text. So the two midrashim that I want to share with you both explore possible significance of Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Let us make the human in our image. Now, the rabbis were Unitarian monotheists. They were not Trinitarian monotheists. So the interpretive option of there's a plurality of voices within the one God is not a possible reading for the rabbis. God the Father could not have been speaking to God the Son and God the Spirit in a Jewish reading of that verse. It's axiomatic. So then the question is, well, with whom did God take counsel? And then you have a lot of interesting answers. The two midrashim that I brought give two different answers. The first answer is that God took counsel with the already created works of creation and said, working with your input, I'm going to do something special. Now, I like that midrash a lot because I'm going to do a midrash on that midrash. and apply it to the 20th and 21st centuries. I want to take that Midrash to say, people who think that it's either creation or evolution are suffering from the fallacy of false dichotomy. Did you ever hear that? The fallacy of false dichotomy. Sometimes the two alternatives don't exhaust all the possibilities, so it's not a true dichotomy. Is it either creation or evolution? Well, this Midrash suggests that, work it out. God says to the earth, from you I'm going to take the carbon, the hydrogen, the oxygen, the nitrogen that was my work in creating you, and I'm going to use that for the new creature. God says to the sun, you are at the proper distance from the planet where I'm creating this new creature so that water is in its liquid form. That's going to be the basis of his biochemistry. God says to the single-celled creatures created earlier, from you I'm going to take the basic metabolic pathways, the amino acids, the basic way of being alive. God says to the vertebrates of the 5th day, from you I'm going to take the basic body plan. God says to the primates of the 6th day, from you I'm going to take enlarged cranial capacity. God says to the hominins, who apparently went extinct somewhere around 5:45 in the morning on the 6th day, from you I'm going to take bipedalism and opposable thumbs. God said to our close cousins, the Neanderthal, from you I'm going to take the capacity to wonder about what will happen after I die. And taking all these together, I'm going to create the human. First of all, it's a lovely thought. It's a lovely thought. And secondly, it reminds us that evolution, so that's how God does it, is an option that explores what's not otherwise simply a dichotomy. The second Midrash is probably the more famous of the two. The two Midrashim are both in your handouts. It's the last two pages. The second Midrash says God took counsel with the angels, but in a different kind of a way. The Hebrew word "let us make" is nun ayin sin he, na'aseh. Now the Hebrew text is written without any vowels. So what you have is N, rough breathing. You may know this from classical Greek. N, rough breathing, S, H. Na'aseh. But you don't have any of the vowels. So the rabbi who created the second Midrash says, Na'aseh is not the way to read that word. Read the word na'asah. Has been created already. Not let us make, but has been made. So the second Midrash says, this is Midrash number 5. Rabbi Simon said, when the Holy Blessed One came to create Adam, the ministering angels formed themselves into groups and parties, some of them saying, let him be created, while others are urged, let him not be created. So imagine, what a great scene. You've got the angels ministering up in heaven who have been divided into camps. Some of them say, God, no disrespect, but not a good idea. Others say, oh God, what a great idea. So, first of all, it's a marvelously free invention of rabbinic fantasy. We should recognize that the Midrash allows for imaginative play. You should definitely not read this as prose, as simple expository prose. So there's a verse from Psalms 85. Love and truth fought together, righteousness and peace combated each other. So love is the name of one of the ministering angel bands. Truth is another one. Righteousness is another one. Peace is another one. Love said, let the human be created, because he will perform deeds of love. Truth said, let him not going to be created. He's going to be an inveterate liar. Who's to say the truth is wrong? Humans are inveterate liars. But love is right too. Humans can concretize love in this world. Peace said, don't create him. He's the most aggressive of any species you've done. You think Tyrannosaurus Rex was dangerous? This one's going to create more extinction than all the T-Rexes put together. So, what does God do? God leaves them debating in the conference room. They're talking so much they don't realize. God just goes ahead and makes the human and says, you can stop arguing now. Na'asa Adam b'tzalmenu. The human has been created in the divine image. First of all, it's a lovely story. It's a lovely sidebar story. It answers the problem the rabbis are concerned to answer, which is, what about this seeming plural, let us create? If the Trinitarian Christian option of reading it is not open to us, then how indeed are we going to read this? Remember that Christians and rabbis were having a tug of war over how to read these words. And none of the other non-Jewish interlocutors of the rabbis ever claimed Scripture as their own. I mean, there were pagans who could read Scripture and quote Scripture, but they weren't saying this is for us. So for the rabbis, the growth of Christianity was a particular challenge, because it was a challenge to the rabbinic claim that this is our book. So you have lots and lots of Midrash, which has a kind of an unspoken defensive agenda, rescuing our book for our circle of readers. This is obviously one of those. Otherwise, you wouldn't have 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 different answers to why does it say in the plural, let us make. Obviously, it bothered them, and a bunch of different clever rabbis gave a bunch of different clever sermons, and they all got put together into this Midrash book. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a frank recognition that the human, certainly part of creation, is in some ways a special part of creation, some ways a distinct part of creation, one with more powers than the others, but with every added power comes added responsibility. And so we know today, and we've known for about 50 years, what we need to be working on, and we've been resisting doing that, and it's almost too late. But it's not quite too late, but it's almost too late. We need to reckon with our powers and be more responsible, so that this beautiful world that God has created and in which God has placed us endures for children's children. Thank you.